Chapter 027. Cast Adrift. Zorian's eyes abruptly shot open as a sharp pain erupted from his stomach. His whole body convulsed, buckling against the object that fell on him, and suddenly he was wide awake, not a trace of drowsiness in his mind. "Good morning, brother," an annoyingly cheerful voice sounded right on top of him. "Morning, morning, morning." Relief immediately flooded his mind, closely followed by despair. He did it. He kept his soul safe from the third time traveler and survived the encounter entirely unscathed. But his allies. "Zorian, are you all right?" Zorian stared at his sister for several long seconds, a million thoughts racing through his mind. She looked uncomfortable with his blank stare and silence, but Zorian couldn't really bring himself to care at the moment. His mind was still stuck on his desperate escape from Red Robe. On the fact that he almost got captured by a mass-murdering psychotic necromancer with an untold amount of time-looping experience. On the fact that said necromancer now knew there were other human time travelers running around and could be coming after him this very moment. On the fact that the Arania were dead. Dead and never coming back. He absent-mindedly pushed Kiriel off of him, put on his glasses and started pacing around the room. Killing a soul was impossible. They could not be destroyed, only modified. Everyone said so. The teachers, all the books he had read discussing the topic, Kale the amateur necromancer. Hell, even the goddamn Lich had said so in one of his offhand comments back when Zorian was first brought into the time loop. How then did Red Robe manage to kill the souls of the Arania? He supposed the simplest explanation would be that Red Robe simply found out something that normal mages hadn't. He was a necromancer with a huge amount of time and an easy way to avoid the usual consequences of various grisly experiments. Perhaps he succeeded where other necromancers had failed. Zorian didn't think this was likely. The Lich seemed to be a better mage than anyone he had met thus far, Red Robe included, and he certainly considered a soul-killing spell impossible. But that just might all be wishful thinking on his part. He didn't want the Arania to be gone for good. Damn it, he had grown to like the stupid spiders. Sure, they'd had their disagreements, but he had really never wished them ill, and he didn't think they had wished him ill either. Novelty certainly hadn't, and she couldn't lie to save her life. If he was being perfectly honest with himself, he had practically thought of Novelty as a second little sister. But now she was gone, just like the rest of the Arania beneath Cyoria. And the worst thing? He let it happen. He had spent the whole evening gathering the matriarch's last message, oblivious and uncaring to what was really happening, while Red Robe was hunting down the Arania across the city. He had known he was dealing with another time traveler, and he had never once considered that the man might have developed countermeasures against others of their kind. Gods, he felt so stupid now. Oh, it was strange. First of all, if Red Robe could permanently get rid of anyone who bothered him with a spell like that, why hadn't he used it more often? Surely the invasion would be a lot easier if he got rid of a couple of key stumbling blocks. Yet Zorian never heard of any notable people waking up dead at the start of each restart. And he had access to the extensive information network maintained by the Arania. There was an obvious answer to that, of course. There could be a significant cost associated with the spell which Red Robe was unwilling to pay. But the fact that he had gone out of the way to remove every single Arania in Cyoria made Zorian doubt that. If there was a serious cost associated with it, he would have made sure to investigate more thoroughly and soul kill only those he had to. Secondly, the Arania weren't actually time travelers, so the spell shouldn't have worked. Zorian was quite sure that the time loop didn't pull every soul back in time. If that was the case, every mage would feel the difference after a dozen or so restarts as their shaping skills miraculously increased overnight. Plus, there are normal necromantic killing spells that forcibly banish the soul from the body to kill people, and Zorian had occasionally seen them in use during the invasion. If every person whose soul was banished from their body ended up dead at the start of the time loop, the number of inexplicable corpses showing up at the start of the time loop would have started to pile up quickly, and everyone would have realized something was very wrong by the time Zorian was brought in. So all in all, clearly the souls of regular people who were not time travelers weren't affected by anything that happened to them in previous time loops. The fact that Red Robe's spell affected normal people in future time loops was strange, to say the least. Zorian stopped pacing and frowned, idly noting that Kiriel had left the room at some point. He was getting the feeling that Red Robe was exploiting the very nature of the time loop to somehow get the desired effect. Zorian himself had no idea how the time loop really functioned, but presumably Red Robe did. Without that knowledge, he was probably never going to figure it out. Like always, he needed more information. Except his main source of information, the Urania, had been utterly wiped out by the enemy, leaving him with nothing except a cryptic, incomplete dying message. Damn it. Over the next few hours, Zorian simply went through the motions, trying to hide the frustration, shame and panic he was feeling and to appear as normal as possible. He had failed to keep his inner turmoil strictly to himself, if Mother's worried questions were any indication, but in the end she accepted his explanation of being slightly shaken from a recent nightmare and stopped bothering him, so he took that as a win. And what a nightmare it was. Aside from losing the Urania, there was a non-negligible chance that Red Robe managed to figure out his identity and was going to assault the house at any moment now. True, he had managed to hide his face behind a scarf and had never spoken, but there were ways nonetheless. He didn't even think about trying to immediately leave the house in panic, though. The first and main reason for that was that if Red Robe had identified him and was coming to Siren, then his family was in danger of being permanently killed, just like the Urania, and he wasn't willing to let that happen. Kiri had grown on him over the course of the time loop, and while he didn't like his mother very much, he wouldn't let some psycho murder her. No, it was bad enough that the Urania had paid the ultimate price for his mistakes. He'd be damned if he'd leave his family to save his own hide. The second reason was that, while it was certainly possible that his identity had been compromised, it was just that, a possibility, not a certainty. Yes, it would be easy to track him down by noting which students from Zach's class were missing and then checking them out one by one, but it was entirely possible that Red Robe wouldn't think of it. After all, as far as Red Robe was concerned, the mysterious human time traveler was associated with the Urania, not Zach. There was no reason to search for him among Zach's classmates. And while Zach probably knew that Zorian was a time traveler by now, Zorian strongly suspected he would be out of Cyoria when Red Robe came knocking. If Zach had even a smidgen of common sense, not a certainty admittedly, he would skip town first thing in the morning upon starting a new restart. Considering Red Robe thoroughly trounced Zach during the invasion by bringing the Lich as his backup, and that Zach actually remembered it happening this time, Zorian felt that even Zach wouldn't be crazy enough to stay where the clearly superior enemy could find him. That was a lot of assumptions to rely on, but what else did he have left? He was backed into a corner. All he could do was wait and hope Red Robe wasn't a master detective on top of being a scarily good necromancer and gods know what else. In any case, his plan was quite simple at the moment. Go board the train as normal, then promptly disembark upon leaving Siren. He had no intention of going back to Cyoria in the near future. Red Robe was bound to pay attention to Cyoria for a while, trying to catch any time travelers the Urania may have brought in, so going there so soon would be just begging for trouble. Any minor misstep could blow his cover, and he didn't trust himself to be able to lay low for multiple restarts at a time. No, best if he avoided the city for a while. He would have to return there at some point, of course, but he had to be a lot stronger and a lot better informed before he could show himself in the city again. Aside from his determination to avoid Cyoria at all costs, his plans were virtually non-existent. He was feeling rather lost at the moment. All emotional attachment aside, the Urania were also his best allies in this messed-up event, and losing them effectively pulled the rug from under his feet. What the hell was he supposed to do now? The conclusion he settled on was that he needed some time to calm down and come to terms with what happened. Think up a new way forward. He would probably end up just wandering around the country for a restart or two. Or maybe a dozen restarts. Yes, now that he thought about it the time loop was the perfect time for him to go on a countrywide, maybe even a continent-wide tour. Just exploring and sightseeing. Very relaxing. Admittedly, the matriarch's last message mentioned something about the time loop gradually decaying, but she named no concrete deadlines in the fragments he had managed to piece together, and he believed she would have put greater emphasis on that part if the timetable was particularly tight. No, that statement was there just to let him know he did not have an infinite amount of time to work with. He had some fairly large but very much finite number to look forward to, and time was steadily ticking. At least he hoped. He was quite doomed otherwise. Large but finite he could work with, but if he had only a handful of restarts left? It didn't bear thinking about. Mr. Kaczynski? Ilsa said, breaking him out of his thoughts. Just as well, his thoughts had taken a dark turn again and he was tired of feeling depressed. Are you listening to me? I'm listening, Zorian lied. He wasn't really listening, of course, but that was because he'd had this conversation with Ilsa a million times by now. Right, Ilsa said dubiously. As I was saying, You can pick up your badge when you finish school since it's so expensive and dash. What if I want to pick it up now? Zorian interrupted. His savings should be enough to fund a month of aimless wandering, so he probably didn't need the badge for work. But he didn't like the idea of keeping his spellcasting abilities a secret lest some overzealous policeman report him to the guild and ultimately bring the academy in. Having a badge to prove his certification and membership would allow him to do as he pleased for the most part. You can pick one up at any of the Mage Guild offices scattered around Aldemar, Ilsa said. Most large cities and regional centers have one. Oh good. He had feared he could only pick one up at the academy or something. Eventually, Ilsa left, her parting words being that she looked forward to seeing him in class. That was new. Did she suspect he intended to blow off school to do his own thing? Well, whatever, even if she did, it did not matter much. The academy always had a rather anemic response to students who didn't show up for class. They would send a letter to his parents informing them that he wasn't attending his classes, and that was it. And fortunately for Zorian, no one would be at home to read the mail by the time the letter arrived, since his parents were going to Koth to visit their precious Daimen. Satisfied that his course had been set for the moment, he picked up his things and set off towards the train station. Break. As the train departed from Siren and started its journey towards Syoria, Zorian began to relax somewhat. Part of that was that train rides always made him kind of sleepy and therefore sapped the tension straight out of his body and mind, but a great deal of it came from the fact that Red Robe was nowhere to be seen. Hours had passed. Enough time to prepare and mount an attack on the Kaczynski household several times over for someone of Red Robe's abilities. And no hostile force had struck against him or his family, so chances were that Red Robe wasn't coming at all. That meant his identity was probably safe for now, which was a major relief. If he hadn't discovered Zorian's identity in the previous restart, he probably wouldn't discover it at all. A month was ample time to track him down if Red Robe knew where to look. He wouldn't really relax fully until several restarts passed as peacefully as this one, but this was an encouraging sign. He just had to make sure he didn't make any more stupid mistakes in the future. The train stopped for a moment and then continued onward towards Syoria. Zorian opted to stay on the train for now, despite his initial intention of getting off the train on the very first station after Siren. The first stop after Siren was an even smaller village that gravitated towards Siren and had nothing notable to recommend it to anyone. Him disembarking there would be noted and remarked upon by the inhabitants, and there was a chance that someone might recognize him and report him to his family before they could leave for Koth. And that was the kind of drama he really didn't need at the moment. And besides, what the hell would he do in a tiny unfamiliar village like that? No, it was far better to wait until Nigelvar and then travel on foot to Teshingrad. Nigelvar was also a small town of little note, but it was an important enough transport junction that no one would find a traveler who disembarked there on the way particularly strange. Teshingrad was a regional capital. It couldn't hold a candle to Eldamar, Korsa or Syoria, but it was big and influential enough that newcomers were normal. Teshingrad also had a mage guild office, so he could pick up his badge there. He disembarked at Nigelvar without complications and immediately set out towards Teshingrad. Unfortunately for him, the storm that invariably hit Syoria on the first day of every restart was apparently a more wide-scale phenomenon than he first thought, because he found himself in the middle of a raging rainstorm halfway there. His rain shield thankfully held out long enough for him to reach one of the roadside inns and take shelter there. He ended up spending the night there, slightly annoyed at the delay despite not having any concrete plans for the restart. It did not help that the food was terrible and the people kept giving him funny looks. It was probably his clothes. The ones his mother made him wear were clearly a bit fancy and out of the price range of most commoners, and he didn't have the chance to change before entering the inn. He made sure to put a basic warding scheme on his room to deter would-be thieves and attackers, but thankfully no one tried anything while he slept. Having survived the night at the inn without incident, Zorian departed the place early in the morning and reached Teshingrad a few hours later, only to get unpleasantly surprised when he tried to pick up his badge. As it turned out, Ilsa had not been exaggerating when she said the badge was expensive. It would cost him half of his savings to have one of those made. It was a highway robbery in Zorian's opinion, but the man he spoke with in the Mage Guild office wouldn't hear anything about lowering the price. Instead he pointed Zorian at a nearby wall where a job panel stood. It was similar to the job panel posted at the academy in Syoria, only the jobs were much more reasonably priced, since the town did not have the same glut of amateur mages that Cyoria did. It would take 2 days for Zorian's badge to be ready for pickup, so he figured he may as well earn some money while he waited to replenish his money stash. It wasn't like he had something better to do. The job list was rather more eclectic than he hoped. He was sure that 2 chickens and a bag of flour was a fair price for fixing up a broken wall, but it was of no use to him personally. And the couple of job postings that did not define any concrete payment sounded very suspicious to him. Even so, he still found plenty of things to occupy his time with. Thus, for the next 3 days, Zorian helped with a bunch of repairs, tracked down a missing goat, carried a stack of stone blocks from one end of the town to the other on one of his floating discs, helped the local alchemist harvest her herbs, and eradicated a particularly nasty rat infestation in one of the private granaries on the edge of town. None of it was particularly difficult, but Zorian would be lying if he said he didn't learn anything in the process. It was a lot different knowing a spell academically and trying to use it to solve concrete problems. "Well, there you go," the man behind the counter said, handing Zorian his badge. It was quite unexceptional in appearance, though Zorian could feel a complex spell formula embedded in it when his fingers touched the surface. He would have to take one of these things apart someday to see what that was about. You can apply to any job you want with that, not just unofficial ones like the ones on the job board. Nice work, by the way. It's been a while since someone went through the town and helped out the townsfolk like that. I didn't really do it out of charity, Zorian grumbled. Oh, I know, the man said. But there are a lot of mages who would consider such petty jobs to be beneath them and refuse to do them out of principle. A lot of them look like something the civilians could do on their own, Zorian admitted. And no offense, but why don't you help if it's something that so desperately needs doing? I kind of doubt the guild would place a non-mage as their representative for the area. Ha! The man laughed, not at all insulted by the accusation. I do in fact help, when I find the time. This position is a lot busier than it appears, trust me on that. And while those jobs are admittedly not very desperate, most of them would take great efforts and a lot of time to accomplish without magic, whereas even a baby mage like yourself can solve them in less than an hour with a handful of spells. So yeah, maybe you didn't save the world in the past few days or whatever, but the people you helped are certainly glad you made their lives a little easier. The townsfolk saved some time, you got some easy cash to spend, and I got rid of some of my more annoying obligations. Everyone's a winner, no? Said Zorian noncommittally. So, do you have a specific job already waiting for you, or are you in search of one? The man asked. Nothing specific, Zorian said. I was going to wander around for a while and see what catches my eye. Ah, I see. Well, I can recommend a few neighboring sites if you're interested in checking them out. Sure, shrugged Zorian. It can't hurt to check things out, I guess. Alternatively, if you're looking for a better paying version of the sort of one-off jobs you've been doing for the past few days, I recommend you go north, towards the Sorokian Highlands. Always plenty of work at the frontier, whether it's in infrastructure building or hunting monsters and whatnot. Much more dangerous than hunting overgrown rats, of course, but also a lot more profitable. An interesting idea, Zorian said. The only problem was that Cyoria was the main springboard for the expansion efforts into the Highlands. From what Zorian could figure out from the maps, it was very hard to bypass Cyoria when going that far north, and he didn't want to be anywhere near the city for the foreseeable future. You know, I can't help but notice that the Mage Guild is pushing the settlement of the Sorokian Highlands pretty aggressively. What's up with that? Ah, well, it's the whole thing with the splintering, you see. Successor states are always looking to one-up each other and searching for advantages that could let them overcome their enemies. Aldemar has a nice big access to untamed wilderness to the north, so it would be a bit silly not to take advantage of it. It's a place rich in natural resources, I hear, both magical and mundane. Zorian spent an hour with the man discussing the region and his options. He didn't really want to settle down in any place in this particular restart, but he supposed he might want to try out some of the options presented by the man in the future, and in that case it might be convenient to have visited the location already and thus be capable of teleporting there directly. So for the next 2 weeks, Zorian walked around the region, visiting various workshops, libraries, alchemists, herbalists and so on. Or just plain sightseeing and doing odd jobs for the villagers and townsfolk he encountered along the way. He did not stop his magical training, but in the absence of any sort of clear goal or a convenient repository of spells like the Academy Library had been, he defaulted to the most basic of advancement methods, shaping exercises. It helped that most of the rural mages he met on his journey had some private shaping exercise they were willing to show him. And unlike Svim, who simply told him the end result he wanted and refused to elaborate, they actually had detailed instructions about what to do and in what order. By the end of the time loop, Zorian had learned how to peel the surface of a marble away layer by layer, how to do the same to an apple and other fruit, how to cut paper by dragging his finger along the cutting line, how to induce a gentle ripple in a pool of water without touching it, how to levitate a blob of water and shape it into a perfect sphere, then freeze that sphere, and finally, how to telekinetically draw geometric shapes in the dust. None of those were really mastered in the Svim sense of the word, but luckily Svim wasn't anywhere near him this time, so he could simply move on to the next exercise when he felt he had absorbed it to his liking. Shaping exercises were a lot less annoying when he didn't have to keep doing them until they could be done flawlessly, he found. He also continued practicing his mind powers. They were extremely important, he felt. If it weren't for them, he would have never survived his altercation with Red Robe intact. At some point he planned to seek out other Iranian colonies and execute his exploit the time loop to slowly leech Iranian magic from them plan, but right now he couldn't do it. It was too soon. His memories of Irania and their demise, and the role his obliviousness and carelessness played in it, too fresh in his mind. So instead he simply used his empathy on every person he spoke to and practiced connecting to the minds of various animals. He particularly liked walking near streams and ponds and taking control of the dragonflies flitting about in order to make them perform dizzying acrobatics around him. Insects had such rudimentary minds that taking total control over them was exceedingly easy, though figuring out how to puppeteer them effectively took some doing, and he still couldn't keep control over more than 3 dragonflies at the same time. Time passed. For the most part he managed to keep himself busy enough that he didn't have enough time to be depressed. But all his worries and feelings of powerlessness returned in full force every evening as he prepared himself for sleep. Every plan he tried to make seemed hollow, doomed to failure. He wasn't powerful enough. He didn't know enough. Red Robe had years and years of experience over him, and that was never going to change. As the end of the restart approached, his mood only turned darker. He had avoided another confrontation in this restart, but what about the next? Would he wake up next time to eerie silence, only to find out that Red Robe got to his family after he had left and left them lifeless, soulless husks for him to find? On the last night of the restart, Zorian didn't sleep at all, simply watching the night sky from a small, isolated hill he had found in his travels, idly using his mind powers to deflect mosquitoes away from him as he stood consumed in his own thoughts. Break. Zorian's eyes abruptly shot open as a sharp pain erupted from his stomach. His whole body convulsed, buckling against the object that fell on him, and suddenly he was wide awake, not a trace of drowsiness in his mind. Good morning, hey. Kiriel yelped as Zorian enveloped her into a strong hug. What the hell, Zorian? Let me go, you brute. Still the same Kiriel as ever. Zorian sighed dramatically, a weak smile on his face. Now get off of me before I hug you some more. His family was all right, and just like in the previous restart, Red Robe was nowhere to be seen. Thus, a much happier Zorian once again boarded the train and disembarked at Nigelvar. He didn't bother picking up his badge this time, though it really was very expensive and no one had actually asked to see it anyway. Instead he simply teleported himself to the last place he'd been at in the previous restart and continued his wanderings. Being a mage out there in the periphery was a lot different than being a mage in Cyoria, Zorian mused. Without the massive quantities of ambient mana gushing out of the hole, conserving mana was actually a noticeable issue. Even shaping exercises tended to deplete his reserves after a couple of hours, whereas back in Cyoria his main limitation had been his patience and existing obligations eating into his free time. That was another reason why Zorian focused on shaping exercises in preference to any actual spellcasting while traveling. He was also starting to miss the Academy Library. He had thought its reputation was way overblown for a while now, but now that he could no longer hit its vast shelves every time he ran into some issue, he realized just how damn convenient it really was. It had a lot of holes where really exotic topics were concerned, but its selection of basic spells and books on common topics was second to none. Out here in the periphery, finding a spellbook that had the exact spell you needed was damn hard. They existed, but they had only the most basic of things, and if you wanted anything exotic you were directed to some other settlement or private collection or whatnot. He also found out that magic detection spells were a lot more useful than he had first realized. Outside of Cyoria, Magical items and creatures actually stood out when exposed to such scrutiny. Back in Cyoria, most general magic detection spells just returned false positives all the time. You had to narrow your divination criteria down to something specific to get results. All in all, he was starting to understand why mages tended to flock towards Cyoria and other cities situated on top of mana wells. Those kinds of places provided a whole lot of resources that were hard to acquire elsewhere in one convenient location. But Zorian's journey continued. He was determined to visit every large city in the country, if nothing else then so he could teleport to any of them as he pleased, and he was seriously considering a journey around the continent as well. The only thing stopping him was that international travel was bound to be a hassle, and he was doing all this traveling to relax, not argue with border officials about authorization. When another restart passed and Red Robe still failed to show up, Zorian finally allowed himself to more fully relax. It had been 3 restarts and Red Robe still hadn't tracked Zorian down. He was pretty sure that meant he never would then. Not a master detective then, that was good to know. Buoyed by the knowledge that he dodged the bullet this time, Zorian seriously considered what to do next. He needed to contact Zack, but it wasn't a priority. Zack likely didn't have any crucial information that would help Zorian figure out how the time loop functioned, and Zorian didn't know how to find the other time traveler anyway. They were bound to meet again at some point, and Zorian wasn't going to play dumb again when they finally encountered one another, but he saw no need to waste his time on looking for a boy who probably didn't want to be found right now. It wasn't like he didn't have anything to do in the meantime. He absolutely needed to master a number of skills before he considered going back to Cyoria and looking for Zack. He needed to find out more about soul magic, he needed to hone his mind magic into a proper tool and weapon like the Arania had done, and he needed to raise his combat skills to a level where he could meaningfully counter Red Robe in open combat. The first priority was pretty obvious. He needed to know how to at least counter soul magic if he wasn't going to get blindsided again when dealing with Red Robe. Preferably he also wanted to figure out what Red Robe really did to the Arania and, if possible, reverse it. He still had Kale's list of people who could help him in that regard, and all of them were conveniently outside of Cyoria. The second was just as crucial. Whatever knowledge about the time loop the matriarch gained behind his back, she almost certainly did it by ripping it out of someone's mind. Someone who wasn't Red Robe, probably a handful of normal people not aware of the time loop but still holding a small part of the puzzle. If he could identify these key people and read their minds, he could find out what the big secret was. In other words, he needed to develop his mind magic, ethics be damned. He didn't think he could do this on his own, so he would have to seek out other Arania webs for this. Lastly, he was embarrassingly powerless against Red Robe in their last encounter, and if the other mage hadn't made some big mistakes when handling him, he would have lost utterly. He needed better traps and ambush tactics, better combat skills in order to not be utterly doomed when said ambushes fail, and better movement magic to retreat and escape when said combat skills prove insufficient. As far as he could tell, the only effective way to improve here was simple practice. In other words, going around and looking for trouble. The only problem with this was that this went against pretty much every instinct he had. It would have to be done, though. He figured that delving into the dungeon and taking a few restarts to visit the untamed wilderness to the north should do for a start, and he would figure out later where to go from there. In line with those goals, he decided that his third post-Arania restart was going to be a bit more systematic than his previous wanderings. After marking down the locations of Kale's associates on a map, he chose a medium-sized town called Nyazovdvary as his next destination. The town was close to the northern wilderness and had a notable dungeon access, so there should be plenty of opportunities to practice his combat skills. It was situated on top of a rank 2 mana well, which was fairly anemic as far as mana wells went but was nonetheless better than nothing. And finally, it was roughly in the center of a diffuse cloud of Kale's associates scattered throughout the region, so he would have easy access to the rest of them should the one in the city prove to be a dead end. It was, as far as Zorian could tell, an ideal place to start at. The next day he teleported to the nearest town he could reach with his teleport spell and set off towards his target. Chapter 028. Cauldron. Life takes you to all sorts of unexpected places, Zorian mused, once again taking the knife to the winter wolf's corpse. If someone had told me back in my first year at the academy that I would need to know what the best way to skin a winter wolf was, I would not have believed them. Then again, he technically didn't need to skin the animal. He just felt it would be a horrid waste not to, since winter wolf pelts fetched a pretty high price back in Nyazovdvary. If he was going to venture into the wilderness, looking for monsters and dangerous animals to fight, he might as well earn some money doing it. Finally, the bloody work was done. He was sure a real hunter could have done it in a quarter of the time and hassle, but he didn't care. A success was a success. He placed the pelt in his bag and went off in the direction of the stream he had encountered earlier, intent on washing the blood and grime off his hands and clothes. At some point he intended to use spells to do these sorts of things, but since harvesting spells were based on animation, they were sort of useless to him right now. Animation spells worked by embedding a portion of the caster's mind into the spell, so until Zorian knew how to properly skin an animal the old-fashioned way, he couldn't hand it off to an animation spell. As he walked towards the stream, he kept an eye out for the reason he was in this particular section of the forest in the first place. A small cottage of an old witch called Silver Lake, who was one of the possible sources Kale had named in his list. So far, Kale's prediction that he wouldn't be able to find the place on his own and that he would have to loiter around the area until she approached him herself had been entirely correct. No divination could track the cottage down, and he hadn't stumbled onto it by simply wandering around the place. If he didn't have Kale's assurance that someone lived here, he would have given up long ago. The only reason he even managed to pinpoint the area as well as he had was because the old witch had a habit of harvesting all of the alchemically useful plants and mushrooms in the area, and Kale warned him to be on the lookout for suspiciously picked clean areas like this one. With a sigh, he plunged his hands into the stream. The recent rains had caused it to swell into a small muddy river, but the water was good enough for washing his hands in and cooling off. That done, he crouched next to the water and idly studied his reflection. He looked like a mess. He felt like a mess too. While he wasn't entirely out of shape, and this wasn't the first time he ventured into a forest, there was a difference between taking a 2-hour stroll through the semi-tame forest near his town and spending most of the week in the great northern wilderness, hunting winter wolves and dodging snakes and other dangerous wildlife. Thank the gods he had the foresight to put that anti-vermin ward on himself, or else he would have been covered in ticks and leeches by the end of day one. And that was assuming the mosquitoes hadn't driven him mad before that. And the worst thing about it all? He would never get used to it because any muscle growth and body adaptation would be wiped out when this restart ended. He made a note to himself to look into the possibility of getting enhancement potions or rituals to improve strength and stamina, because spending the first week of every restart with every inch of his body tense and hurting wasn't a fun prospect at all. Or at least a potion to ease the weight. Was the bottom of the stream moving? He managed to throw himself back just in time to avoid the huge brown shape that jumped out of the muddy water and tried to envelop his head with its massive jaws. He quickly backpedaled as the huge lizard-like creature tried to haul itself onto the shore and sent a small missile swarm consisting of 3 piercers straight at its head. Thankfully, the lizard thing was actually pretty slow, its surprise attack notwithstanding, so all 3 missiles found their mark. The creature's skull promptly exploded from the impact, showering bits of tissue everywhere, and it immediately slumped dead where it stood, its lower half still submerged in the stream. Zorian immediately turned on his mind sense and scanned the creek for the possible presence of more such monsters, and then, having discovered none, slowly approached the corpse to inspect it. It was a salamander. A huge brown salamander with a massive triangular head and beady black eyes that probably couldn't actually see anything. It was a miracle that something that big could actually hide in a stream this shallow, but the muddy water provided it with just what it needed to surprise him. Damn, that would have been humiliating, killed less than a week in by a giant salamander. Then again, he nearly fell into a ravine on his first day here, and there was that assassin vine that tried to choke him yesterday. Is there anything here in this forest that isn't going to try and kill me the moment I take my eyes off of it? Zorian asked out loud. He didn't expect anyone to answer since he was alone and all, but he did receive an answer. Sort of. What do you think you're doing, feeling all sorry for yourself? A harsh female voice answered him. There was no one present as far as Zorian could see, and his mind sense detected only animals, but he still managed to detect fairly quickly where the voice was coming from. The source of the speech was the raven perched on a nearby branch. Well, don't just stand there and stare at my familiar, boy, the voice said, cutting in through the silence. Quickly haul it out of the creek before the stream washes it away. Do you have any idea how valuable giant salamanders of that size are? This is the find of a century. Zorian was tempted to point out that this find of a century nearly killed him, but decided not to. If this was who he suspected, he needed to stay on her good side. According to Kale, asking the old witch for help was a bit of a long shot, but likely to achieve very good results if he could convince her to seriously try and help him. Silver Lake was very powerful and skilled, but also very annoying to deal with. She wouldn't kill him or do anything overtly hostile to him without provocation, but she was capricious and prone to wasting people's time. Zorian figured it was at least worth a try to approach her for help. "You would be Miss Silver Lake, I presume?" guessed Zorian. The raven answered him with a burst of laughter. It was really strange to see a bird laugh like that. "Miss am I? Well, aren't you a polite one? Don't get too many of those these days. Why, maybe I'll even listen to whatever silly request you came here for," the bird finally said. "Now why are you just standing around? Didn't I give you a task to accomplish?" With a sigh, Zorian turned away from the bird and started casting a levitation spell to haul the giant amphibian out of the water. Break. Silver Lake, no last name, and he shouldn't ask about how she ended up without one. Kale was very firm on that part. Was not like Zorian had expected her. She was old, yes, but for a woman of 90 years she was incredibly lively and spry. In fact, Zorian had a feeling she had an easier time moving through the forest than he did. She wasn't particularly unkempt either, despite living in the middle of the wilderness. Her pitch-black hair was devoid of a single white strand, she probably dyed it regularly, and the simple brown dress she was wearing was unremarkable but immaculate. If it weren't for the wrinkles, he would have pegged her as less than half her age. Was this a consequence of some sort of potion regimen, or was she just lucky that way? Well, no matter. Zorian followed her back to her cottage, the giant salamander floating behind him on a disc of force, where she promptly started to butcher the beast with practiced ease. Her hands didn't tremble at all as she handled the various knives and heavy jars at her place, and Zorian became even more certain she put herself through some kind of enhancement regimen to ward off the effect of aging. She was a potion master according to Kale, and alchemy had always been one of the best ways to prolong your life and keep yourself healthy. "Don't think I didn't notice you faffing around the area for the past few days," she suddenly said, never taking her eyes off the salamander corpse. "Rather annoying, that. Also worrying. Means that someone told you where to find me. I don't suppose you could shed some light on that, could you?" "Kale told me where to find you," Zorian readily admitted. "It wasn't a secret, really." "Kale?" she asked before frowning. "No, wait, don't tell me. I'm sure I heard that name Sambo. Now I remember. He's the little rascal that knocked up Freya's granddaughter. But I heard he ended up marrying her afterwards, so I guess that's not so bad. Actually, I recall that Freya had been quite happy about that. She had been afraid the girl would never find herself a husband." "Why?" asked Zorian curiously. Silver Lake shot him a judging look, her brown eyes boring into his own before returning to her work. "I mean, if it isn't impertinent to ask. You don't have to dash." "Relax, boy," Silver Lake snorted derisively. "I am a lot of things, but I was never very tactful. If I'm bothered by something you say, I will tell you. If you ask something impertinent, I will tell you to go screw yourself. I'm just thinking. Let's see. As you probably suspect by now, Freya, Kale's mother-in-law, is a witch like me. There are some nasty rumors circulating about witches and their daughters, about how they sacrifice male children, have orgies with summoned demons, poison their husbands for inheritance, how they're too lazy to work around the house, and other ridiculous bilge. It makes a lot of men reluctant to marry the daughter of a witch." "I see," said Zorian. He had never heard about that particular issue, but it sounded plausible enough. Witches had a really bad reputation for dabbling in various unethical and forbidden magics. "It's been years since I last seen Kale and his wife," Silver Lake said. "Or Freya for that matter. I guess I should have been a little less harsh the last time they visited, but, well, what's done is done. It's strange the Morlock saw fit to send you here when he himself dares not show his face to me." Zorian frowned. "I think you're misinterpreting the situation somewhat. I don't know what happened between you and them, but the reason they haven't visited you is because they're dead. Freya and Kale's wife both contracted the weeping and died. As for Kale, he had been too busy grieving and taking care of his daughter to go on a trip like this. You are rather isolated." For the first time since he met her, Silver Lake seemed taken aback by his answer. "Dead? Freya is. And all this time I thought," she mumbled before halting and giving him a considering look. "Wait. You said Kale and his daughter." Silver Lake spent the next few minutes considering something. Zorian took the time to observe and study the cottage next to them. It looked rather flimsy and old, but it shone like a lighthouse to his senses when he discreetly cast a magic detection spell on it. How the hell hadn't he noticed the thing earlier when he was searching for it? Those must be some powerful divination wards she placed on it. He couldn't figure out how she was powering them, though wards that strong needed a powerful source of magic, and this place wasn't a mana well. There was no way Silver Lake could be powerful enough to provide enough mana for the entire edifice, could she? Kale did mention that she was extremely strong and skilled in magic of both Icosian and Witch origin, and that he should never underestimate her, but this was still beyond what he was expecting. Aside from the impossibly complex and powerful warding scheme, though, the cottage looked unremarkable. There were several racks next to it where various herbs and mushrooms were drying in the sun, but it wasn't unknown for hunters and lumberjacks to have a side business of gathering herbs to sell in the nearby city, so hardly something that would raise warning flags all by itself. Silver Lake snapped her fingers in front of his face, spraying droplets of salamander blood and other bodily fluids all over his glasses and breaking him out of his inspection. Despite his resolve to be polite to her, Zorian couldn't help but glare at her in response. She just grinned at him, showing him 2 rows of gleaming white teeth. Apparently in all of her 90 years of life she hadn't lost a single tooth. Yes, definitely magic. If you're done gawking at my home we can continue our discussion, she said. I have a request for you. You have a way to get in contact with Kale, yes? Of course, said Zorian. We're friends, he and I. Or they would be once he returned to Cyoria in one of the future restarts. Then I would like you to deliver a message to him, she said. It's nothing urgent, but I want him to know that I regret how our last meeting ended and that I would very much like it if he came to visit me with his daughter sometime in the future. Oh, and that I want to teach his daughter the secrets of my magic. She is a descendant of a proud line of witches stretching back to time immemorial, and it is her birthright to continue it, should she want to. Got all that? Sounds simple enough to remember, Zorian said. And, could I now trouble you with the reason I came here for? No, she snorted. What, you think that just because you know a couple of people close to me and agreed to help me with a simple request like this that I'll jump into whatever crazy problem you need help with? You don't even know why I'm here, Zorian pointed out. Nobody ever comes to me for help with the little things, she said with a grin. If Kale sent you to me, that means he's truly stumped for a solution. I suppose I can't argue with that, Zorian admitted. You see, I don't want to hear it, Silver Lake said, pointing her bloody palm towards him to shut him up. Until you make it worth my time, I don't want to listen to your sob story. If you want my help, you're going to have to earn it. How do I even know you can help me at all then? Asked Zorian. I could end up paying you for nothing in the end. You could, Silver Lake grinned. You will have to risk it. Damn witch. She was probably just wasting his time, but... Fine, he sighed. What do you want from me? If anything, her grin just got wider. Space blurred around Zorian, and then he was back in Nyazovdveri, in one of the less traversed streets where he was fairly sure no one would see him teleporting in and out. It wouldn't be a huge problem if it got out that he could teleport, but at the same time it would be notable and would attract attention to him. Few mages would be willing to teach the spell to a 15-year-old, and even fewer 15-year-olds would be capable of learning it. It would be best if he were discreet about it for now. Seeing how his arrival appeared to have gone unnoticed, he promptly exited the street and went towards the town square to grab something to eat, only to get distracted by the newspaper boys shouting. Shocking news, the boy yelled. A Cyoria mercenary company found dead to a man in their homes. Monsters stalk the streets of the city. Coincidence or conspiracy? Read all about it in today's edition. Shocking news, shocking news. Well, that sounded interesting. Zorian wordlessly shifted his course towards the boy and bought the newspaper in question. He then found a quiet corner to lean on and started to read. Like he suspected, the mercenary company that was found dead was the one he and the Arania hired to participate in the ambush. There was a picture of the man who led the group next to the article, and Zorian would recognize the man anywhere thanks to the distinctive scar he had above his right eye. Apparently they were all found dead at the start of the restart, with little clue as to who killed them and why. Naturally, that immediately produced a lot of interest from anyone, since it clearly wasn't natural. The obvious conclusion, that someone managed to off an entire group of experienced battle mages in the span of a single night, not all of which were asleep at the time of death and some of whom were under heavy wards, was highly disturbing, but there were very few alternatives. Another complication was that immediately after that discovery, there had been a stream of incidents involving various monsters moving out of the dungeon and into the sewers, and sometimes then even emerging into the streets of the city. The experts were baffled as to why this was happening now, and the city leadership was hastily organizing an operation to descend into the dungeon in order to bring the situation under control before the summer festival. Well, that certainly put a damper on the invaders' plans. Sorian wondered how they would deal with that. In retrospect, it wasn't hard to explain why monsters were invading the sewers and the streets of the city. The invaders were putting pressure on them from below, so they went upwards as a response. In the past restarts, the Arania were there to act as an unwilling anvil to the invaders' hammer, preventing the inhabitants of the dungeon from breaking into the upper levels. But the Arania were dead now, and with them gone a whole layer of Sioria's defense that most people hadn't even known about had collapsed. Sorian couldn't suppress a nasty grin at the thought that maybe Red Robe ended up shooting himself in the foot when he enacted his soul-killing tantrum. Interestingly, the mysterious murders and the monster attacks seemed to have had an effect on the academy too. There was a short subarticle next to the main one about the families who withdrew their children from schools in Sioria, including his own academy. Jade, one of his classmates, had been pulled by her parents from the academy. She was listed among the names of notable students who opted to leave the city for their own safety. Her father was a high-ranking member of House Whittleson, while the other notable names included him. Yes, there was no mistaking it. Sorian Kaczynski, younger brother of Daimen Kaczynski, was listed in the article as one of the students pulled from school by his parents. He wondered what that was based on. He was certain no one had managed to contact his parents before they left for Koth, so either the academy or the newspaper had decided to interpret his absence in light of current events and trends. Sorian shook his head and closed the newspaper before continuing on his way. Break. After spending a week in Nyazovdvary, Sorian had decided he kind of liked the town. It was a busy, lively place where the arrival of a newly minted mage like him was unremarkable and raised no eyebrows, yet not so large and prosperous that people like him were common and underappreciated. Thanks to the town's position as a regional center and the presence of both a notable mana well and a dungeon access attractive to dungeon delvers, the town was full of shops catering to mages or requiring mage employees, and thus offered plenty of employment opportunities for a young mage. Enough so that people sometimes offered him employment without him even asking about it. He didn't accept any offers since a regular job would eat up a lot of time and would just distract him from his real quest, but it was something to keep in mind if he ever got out of the time loop. Why, hello there. Mind if I join you for a bit? Sorian peered up from the map of the surrounding region he was studying and took a good look at the man who interrupted him. He was middle-aged, had a prominent mustache and a pot belly, and had a wide smile plastered on his face. Despite the fact that Sorian took several seconds to study him in silence, the man's smile never faltered. Judging by the clothes he was wearing, he seemed to be one of the more well-off residents. A small-time merchant, perhaps, or one of the craftsman mages that had stores in the town. He was probably going to get another job offer, then. Sure, Sorian said, gesturing towards the empty chair on the other end of the table. Help yourself. He thought for a moment whether he should get rid of the map while he talked to the man, but then decided not to bother. There was nothing incriminating on it anyway. A couple of marked-down locations that would mean nothing to the man without some kind of context and some equally unhelpful notes scribbled on the margins. Silverlake had given him a task of gathering rare magical plants all over the damn forest, but gave him only the vaguest clues about where they could be found, so he was reduced to deciphering her statements and consulting the local herbalists for more information. And the local herbalists weren't terribly cooperative. He had a feeling this was only the start of her demands, so he was trying to finish it quickly. Don't mind if I do, don't mind if I do, the man said happily, plopping down onto the offered spot. These old bones just aren't what they once were, I'm afraid. Standing around does terrible things to my knees. I guess the years caught up to me, eh? The pot belly probably doesn't help, Sorian thought inside his head, though outwardly he remained silent, waiting for the man to tell him what he wanted of him. I have to say, this looks like a nice place to relax in, the man said, idly looking at the sheet of paper that listed the prices of some of the meals and beverages. A little pricey but quiet and out of the way. Private. Anyway, you don't mind if I order us a drink, do you? I don't drink alcohol, said Sorian with a shake of his head. And he didn't trust any of the non-alcoholic beverages in a place like this, either. It wasn't that upscale of an establishment, regardless of what the man said. I'm going to have to decline. Now that's just unfair, the man said. Oh well, I guess I'll have to drink alone then. Forgive the impoliteness, but I'm rather parched and it just feels wrong, having a conversation in a tavern without a mug of beer to sip on occasionally. A few minutes later, the man took a swig from his mug and got to the point. Ah, that hits the spot, he said. With that out of the way, allow me to introduce myself. I am Guri Quilly of Quilly and Raffolton Equipment. Though I'm sad to say old Raffolton passed away 2 years ago, so I'm the only owner now. I kept the name as it is, though. Tradition. Zorian resisted the urge to tell him to get on with it. Anyway, I see you're a busy man, so I'll get straight to the point. I've heard you've been going out into the forest to gather alchemical ingredients and hunting winter wolves. And also that you've been selling magic items on the side too? Yes, what of it? Asked Zorian. Nothing he did was in any way illegal. The winter wolves had sizable bounties for every pelt brought to the nearest guild station for the express purpose of encouraging people to hunt them, as they tended to prey on the livestock, children and lone travelers, and selling magic items and alchemical ingredients was hardly a crime. Some places had arcane restrictions about what could and could not be sold and by whom, but those were usually the consequence of regional monopolies granted to someone, and Nyazovdvary was under no one's monopoly. He checked. I'm a certified mage if that's what's bothering you. He even had a badge to prove it. It was pricey, but he interacted too often with mages in the town to risk getting caught doing business without a license. Especially since he had gotten an impression that a couple of shop owners resented the competition he represented and would love to report him to the guild if they could find an excuse. To put it bluntly, I want you to sell your alchemical ingredients and magic items to me instead of my competitors, the man said. Don't think this is some kind of threat or blackmail, though. I'm willing to pay you extra for the privilege. Zorian blinked. He didn't expect that. An hour later, the man had hashed out some sort of agreement with Zorian. The extra money didn't mean all that much to Zorian, but the man did have something he wanted, a fully equipped alchemical workshop that he wasn't using all the time. In exchange for the right to use said workshop from time to time and the right to consult the man's private library for botanical books, Zorian agreed to offer all his products to the man before he did to anyone else. The man seemed pretty pleased with himself at having closed such a deal. Honestly, so was Zorian. The local library had a miserable selection of books on plants and herbs, but Guri claimed his own private library was not nearly so limited. Having access to a proper alchemical workshop was also convenient, and not something he could easily get elsewhere, unless he was willing to teleport to Corsa every time he wanted to make something. And he really didn't have that much mana to burn. How come there is such a demand for potions and magic items here anyway? Asked Zorian. This city seems a little too small for the amount of magic shops. I understand the workshops since they can always export their products elsewhere, but how do shops like yours achieve such volume on the local market? Oh, that's easy, Guri said. Travelers. Or more accurately, settlers and adventurers. You see, this city is one of the last stops for settlers going further north as part of the Great Northern Push, as the government likes to call it. As one of the last centers of real civilization on their journey, we get a lot of demand for critical supplies of all sorts. Great Northern Push? Asked Zorian. Not a regular reader of the newspapers, I take it? It's the whole thing with colonizing the Sorokian highlands that the government has been pushing so hard lately. You must have noticed the posters around advertising free land and tax exemptions and whatnot. It's part of Eldamar's current strategy for achieving supremacy over Sulamnon and Fukrinia. The idea is that by taming the northern wilderness, the country will get a major population and resource boost. All countries that have a border with the wilderness do this to a greater or lesser degree, but Eldamar has really invested a lot into this endeavor. Not sure whether it will be really worth it in the end, but I sure don't mind the traffic it gives me. Now that he thought about it, there were traces of that even back at the academy. It was nothing horribly blatant, but textbooks and class assignments often worked in mentions of the Sorokian highlands far more than one would expect, considering their low population and current importance. In any case, the man soon left and Zorian returned to staring at his map. Goddamn witch. Break. I don't suppose that now that I have brought you the plants you asked for dash. Don't be silly, boy, Silverlake said, snatching the bundle of plants from his hands. You don't really think a silly little fetch quest like this is all it takes to get my help? Think of this as an elimination round. You were horribly slow anyway. Slow, Zorian repeated incredulously. It took me only 3 days. The only reason I could get them all so quickly at all was that I could teleport from place to place. Not to mention the danger involved. You never even told me those red bell mushrooms of yours exploded into clouds of paralyzing dust if handled improperly. Well, that's just common knowledge, she said, waving her hand dismissively. Everyone knows that. Here, grind these snail shells for me, please. Zorian looked at the small leather bag full of colorful red and blue snail shells and frowned. He knew that species of snail. They were used in production of certain drugs and were very much illegal to harvest. More important than that, their ground-up shells were a powerful hallucinogen, and inhaling even a handful of dust would leave him delirious and incapacitated. He threw the annoying old woman a brief glare before simply casting a dust shield spell on himself, the same one he used to protect himself against the paralyzing mushrooms, before grabbing a mortar and pestle and getting down to work. After he was done with that, the old witch promptly handed him the very bundle of plants he had spent 3 days gathering, rattled off a series of brief instructions and pointed him towards an old cauldron leaning on the wall of her cottage. Wonderful. Apparently he was going to be making a potion the old way. He had been tutored by another witch as a child, so he wasn't totally lost here, but the potion she wanted him to make now was unfamiliar to him. Not to mention that there was a reason why traditional potion making was considered obsolete compared to modern alchemy. It was harder, less safe, and usually gave worse results to boot. Hopefully the potion she was having him make wasn't the sort to explode in his face or poison him with fumes if he didn't get it right. Oh, who was he kidding? Of course it was. Frankly, if it weren't for the time loop and the resulting immunity to simple death, he would be leaving at this point. As he suspected, he botched that potion. Thankfully, every time he was about to make a particularly disastrous misstep, Silverlake stopped him. He just wished she found a better way to warn him he was about to make a mistake than hitting him with a willow branch. She could have poked his eye out with that thing. He never thought he would say this, but he was starting to miss Svim and his marbles. His old mentor was a saint compared to this crazy old woman. Well, that's no good, said Silverlake, peering into the cauldron and idly stirring the foul-smelling purple gunk that Zorian ended up producing. It was supposed to be a viscous, sweet-smelling, totally transparent liquid. She gave him a bright smile. I guess you'll have to go gather a whole new batch of ingredients before you can try again, won't you? Zorian stared blankly at the grinning woman, feeling her anticipation through his empathy. She fully expected him to explode at this and was looking forward to it. Sadistic bitch. Unfortunately for her, she was about to get disappointed. He wordlessly reached into his backpack and withdrew a fresh bundle of ingredients. Her smile never faltered, but Zorian could feel her disappointment regardless. It made him smile inside, though he maintained his poker face. You gathered extra, huh? She asked rhetorically. I have plenty of experience with abrasive teachers, Zorian said simply. I have another bundle besides this one too. Good. You'll need it, Silverlake said, knocking on the rim of the cauldron. This was terrible. I don't think 2 attempts will be enough. Hell, I'm skeptical you can get it in 3. Go empty this crap you've made in the neutralization pit over there and start over. Zorian sighed and levitated the cauldron onto a disk of force before marching off into the direction of the neutralization pit. It was really just an open pit that had been lined with stones and painted over with alchemical resin so that alchemical compounds poured into it didn't seep into the ground or nearby water supply. His alchemy teacher back at the academy would have been horrified at the mishandling of alchemical waste. But if the great Silverlake thinks an open pit is sufficient for disposal of alchemical sludge, then who was Zorian to disagree? That done, he placed the cauldron back over by the fireplace and started over. Silverlake was probably right that he wouldn't get it right in the next 2 times either, though the potion clearly required fairly delicate temperature management, but that was a very hard variable to control when using wood burning and a regular fireplace. An old witch with lots of experience like Silverlake probably knew by instinct how to control the fire. But Zorian didn't have the faintest idea of how to do it. That was generally the main problem of traditional alchemy, as it was sometimes called. It relied heavily on the ability of the practitioner to adjust their methods on the fly to produce a usable product. Unlike modern alchemy, which relied on standardized equipment and exact measurements, traditional alchemy was all about eyeballing it and improvisation. Expressions like a handful of leaves, a slow fire, and a moderate amount of time were extremely common in traditional alchemical recipes. Zorian knew because he once broke into his grandmother's recipe cabinet to see if he could learn something from them. A pinch of salt apparently meant very different things to him and his grandmother, if the results of his secret potion attempts were any indication. A further problem for him was that he was only really proficient in producing potions one by one, and the cauldron method was designed for producing batches of potions. There were some very important differences between production methods for single potions and for batches, but how if Zorian could remember what they were at the moment? Who taught you? Silverlake asked suddenly. Huh? Zorian mumbled. What do you mean? You want to know my alchemy teacher? I want to know your potions teacher, she corrected. You're still pretty terrible, but you're not nearly as clueless around the cauldron as I thought you would be. Who taught you? That would be my grandmother, I guess, Zorian said. A witch or just a housewife that picked up a few recipes? Silverlake asked. A witch, said Zorian. Though not a particularly dedicated one, I think. She gave me some lessons when I was a kid, but it didn't last very long. My mother didn't really like her teaching me. Actually, Zorian was pretty sure his mother didn't like his grandmother, period. Mother and daughter did not get along in their case. Zorian always found it kind of hypocritical that mother spent so much time preaching to him about the value of family when she herself couldn't stand her own mother if her life depended on it. Huh. Interesting. Don't expect to get any fuzzy feelings out of me just because of that, though, Silverlake said. Wouldn't dream of it, Zorian said lightly. Good. You'll be happy to know I've decided on the price of my help for you. Oh, said Zorian, suddenly perking up. Yes. You see, a little birdie told me you've been wandering around the forest picking fights with the wildlife. So this should be something right up your alley. Tell me, have you heard of something called the Grey Hunter?